When a ruthless crime lord returns home after a reckless night, he expects routine silence. Instead, he finds something far more terrifying than any enemy he's ever faced: absolute emptiness. His wife is gone, not stolen, not kidnapped, gone by choice. And in her wake, she's left behind divorce papers, stripped rooms, and a chilling truth. While he believed he controlled everything, she was quietly dismantling their marriage, piece by piece, waiting for the perfect moment to vanish forever. Will Dominic Ravel discover what he's lost before it's too late? Stay until the end to find out. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The gates of the Ravel estate opened with their usual whisper of hydraulics and steel, barely audible over the purr of the black Aston Martin gliding through. Dawn hadn't quite broken. The sky hung in that uncertain space between night and morning, bruised purple fading to ash. Dominic Ravel guided the car up the winding drive, his movements automatic, his mind elsewhere. Or more accurately, his mind was still back at the penthouse downtown, still tangled in sheets that weren't his, still breathing air perfumed with someone else's fragrance. He should feel guilt. He knew that intellectually, the way he knew the precise location of every security camera on his property, the way he knew which judges could be bought and which required more persuasive measures. But guilt was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. Guilt implied weakness, and weakness in his world was a death sentence written in blood. The house rose before him, a monument to power and taste. All clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows, steel and glass and stone arranged with architect-designed precision. He'd bought it 5 years ago, back when he still believed beautiful things could fill the hollow spaces inside him. Back when he thought a ring on Lena's finger and a fortress to keep her safe would be enough. Dominic parked in the circular drive rather than the garage. A small rebellion, a minor deviation from routine. Lena would notice, she noticed everything, but she wouldn't say anything. She never did anymore. That was their unspoken agreement, wasn't it? He did what he wanted, and she remained the perfect wife, silent and serene in her designer clothes and her designer life. The front door wasn't locked. That alone should have triggered something in his professionally paranoid mind, but exhaustion dulled his usually sharp instincts. He'd been up for nearly 40 hours, first handling a territorial dispute with the Constantine family, then the emergency meeting with his financial advisors about the federal investigation circling closer, then the escape. The willing distraction waiting in the penthouse. The temporary amnesia that came with someone new, someone who didn't know him well enough yet to look disappointed. The foyer swallowed him in its familiar elegance. Italian marble underfoot. The abstract sculpture Lena had insisted on acquiring from some gallery in Soho, the massive mirror that reflected a man who looked every one of his 38 years this morning. Dark hair disheveled, tie loosened, the shadow of stubble on his jaw. His white shirt, custom-tailored and ruinously expensive, was wrinkled in ways that told a story he hadn't bothered to hide. "Lena?" His voice echoed in the space, bouncing off hard surfaces, finding no purchase. The house had always been quiet. That's what he'd paid for, after all, soundproofing and insulation that turned the interior into a sanctuary from the violent noise of his life. But this was different. This wasn't peaceful silence. This was absence. Dominic moved through the ground floor, his footsteps loud in the stillness. The living room looked untouched, cream sofas positioned just so, coffee table books arranged at precise angles, the Steinway piano in the corner that Lena sometimes played when she thought he wasn't listening. Everything in its place, and yet wrong. It felt wrong. He couldn't articulate what had changed. The paintings still hung on the walls, the furniture hadn't moved, but there was a quality to the air itself that felt different, like the house had exhaled something vital and forgotten to breathe it back in. The kitchen finally gave him concrete evidence that something was amiss. Dominic stopped in the doorway, his trained eye cataloging details. The espresso machine was gone. The vintage La Marzocco that Lena had spent months researching before purchasing, that she'd treated with the care most people reserved for pets. The magnetic knife block that had held her Japanese chef's knives, each blade worth more than most people's monthly rent. Empty. The ceramic container where she kept her loose-leaf tea collection vanished. Small things. Inconsequential things. Except they weren't, were they? On the marble island, centered with deliberate precision, sat a manila envelope. Dominic approached it the way he might approach a bomb, each step measured, his heart rate accelerating in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, terrible understanding beginning to crystallize in his chest. His name was written on the envelope in Lena's handwriting, elegant, controlled, each letter perfectly formed. He'd always admired her penmanship, the old-fashioned care she took with the written word. It was part of what had drawn him to her initially, that sense that she existed slightly out of time, that she valued things the modern world had discarded as irrelevant. Inside the envelope, he found documents, legal documents, professionally prepared, every clause and stipulation laid out in the bloodless language of divorce attorneys. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words swam before his eyes. He had to read them 3 times before they penetrated the shock insulating his brain. She was divorcing him. Lena was divorcing him. No warning, no fight, no tearful confrontation or thrown objects or screamed accusations. Just papers, signed and dated, waiting for his response. He flipped through the documents with hands that had started to shake, a detail that would have embarrassed him if anyone else had been present. The division of assets was spelled out with surgical precision. She wanted nothing from him beyond what she'd brought into the marriage and what she could legally claim. No alimony demands, no attempt to bleed him dry, no leveraging of what she knew about his business dealings. She was cutting him out of her life as cleanly as possible, like a surgeon excising a tumor. At the bottom of the envelope, he found a single key on a plain metal ring, the key to his house. The symbolism was so obvious it made his teeth ache. Dominic stood in the kitchen, divorce papers in one hand, key in the other, trying to reconstruct the moment when everything had changed. When had she decided? When had she planned this? How long had she been preparing to leave while sleeping beside him, sharing meals with him, existing in this house like everything was fine? The questions piled up, unanswerable, without Lena herself, and Lena was gone. He moved through the house with increasing urgency, taking the stairs 2 at a time, his earlier exhaustion burned away by adrenaline and something that might have been panic if he'd been willing to name it. Their bedroom, his bedroom now, he supposed, told the rest of the story. Her side of the massive walk-in closet was empty. Not just empty, erased. The custom shelving that had held her shoes, the velvet-lined drawers where she'd kept jewelry, the section where her dresses had hung in color-coordinated rows, all bare. She'd even taken the hangers. In the bathroom, her toiletries had vanished, the expensive French skincare products, the perfume bottles arranged on the marble counter, the silk robe that had hung on the back of the door, gone. Only his things remained, looking suddenly sparse and masculine in the space they'd shared. He opened her nightstand drawer, empty except for the dust outline where her reading glasses case had been. The books on her side of the bed, the poetry collections and literary fiction she consumed with quiet intensity, removed. The framed photograph of her parents that had sat on the dresser disappeared. She'd moved through this house like a ghost, taking every trace of herself, leaving behind only the footprint of her absence. Dominic sank onto the edge of the bed, still holding the divorce papers, still trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was planned, orchestrated, executed with the kind of precision that suggested weeks, maybe months of preparation. While he'd been lying to her, she'd been preparing to leave him. While he'd been assuming her silence meant acceptance, she'd been building an exit strategy. While he'd been taking her for granted, she'd been systematically dismantling their life together. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably Marcus, his second in command, with updates about last night's situation. Dominic ignored it. For the first time in years, the empire he'd built seemed less important than the woman who'd just walked out of it. He tried to remember the last real conversation they'd had. Not the surface pleasantries exchanged over breakfast, not the polite inquiries about each other's days, but an actual conversation, the kind they used to have in the early days, when he'd believed she might be the one person who could know him completely and stay anyway. When had they stopped talking? When had silence become their primary language? Dominic stood, moving to the windows that overlooked the grounds. The sun was rising properly now, painting the manicured lawns and imported trees in shades of gold. He'd given her all of this. Security, luxury, a life most women would kill for. Wasn't that enough? But even as he formed the thought, he knew it was bullshit. The kind of self-serving rationalization he'd built a career on. Because he hadn't given her what she actually needed, had he? He'd given her things, objects, a beautiful cage, and called it devotion. And then he'd betrayed even that inadequate offering. The affair, if you could even call it that, so transactional and meaningless, had started 3 months ago. A woman he'd met during a business negotiation, someone who understood the rules, who wanted nothing beyond the physical and the material. It wasn't about emotion, it wasn't even really about desire. It was about escape, about having something that was his alone, something that didn't require him to be better than he was. He'd convinced himself Lena didn't know, that he was careful enough, smart enough, protected by the same skills that kept him alive in a world where men were killed for less than disrespect. But looking at the empty closet, the stripped bathroom, the divorce papers bearing her decisive signature, Dominic understood that he'd been deluding himself. She knew. Of course she knew. Lena had always been smarter than he gave her credit for. The question was, how long had she known? He pulled out his phone, pulled up her contact. His thumb hovered over the call button. What would he say? What words existed that could bridge the distance she'd created? "I'm sorry" seemed pathetically inadequate. "Come back" sounded like a command, and he had a sudden, visceral understanding that Lena was done taking orders from him. "I love you" would be the cruelest lie of all, because if he really loved her, would he have done what he'd done? Dominic put the phone away without making the call. He walked through the house again, slower this time, cataloging other absences he'd initially missed. The cashmere throw she liked to curl up with while reading, gone. The special coffee beans she ordered from a small roaster in Portland, missing from the pantry. The yoga mat that had been a permanent fixture in the home gym, vanished. In the study, his domain really, she rarely came in here, he found one last piece of evidence. On his desk, weighted down by a paperweight he'd brought back from Tokyo, was a sticky note in her handwriting. The cameras caught everything. "I know you'll check them eventually. Don't bother. I disabled the system remotely before I left. There's no footage, just like there's no trace of me left in your perfect house. Some absences can't be rewound or replayed." Goodbye, Dominic. He crumpled the note in his fist, then smoothed it out again, reading it 3 more times. She'd thought of everything. Not just the physical removal of her belongings, but the digital trail as well. She'd anticipated his moves, countered them before he could make them. This was chess, and she'd been playing while he wasn't even aware the game had started. When had she become this person? This strategist, this ghost, who could unmake a marriage with the same precision he used to eliminate business rivals? Or had she always been this person, and he'd simply never bothered to look closely enough? Dominic returned to the kitchen, poured himself a drink even though it was barely 7 in the morning, and sat at the island where the divorce papers waited. The whiskey burned, but the pain was welcome. Something tangible, something real in a morning that had taken on the quality of a nightmare. He thought about Lena the day they'd met, 6 years ago at a charity gala he'd attended to maintain appearances. She'd been standing near a window, not socializing like everyone else, just observing. He'd approached her with his usual confidence, used to women who responded to power and money with immediate interest. She'd looked at him like she could see straight through the expensive suit to the violence underneath, and instead of being repelled, she'd seemed curious, like he was a puzzle she wanted to understand. "You're not really here for the charity, are you?" she'd said, her first words to him. He'd appreciated the directness. "Are you?" "I'm here because my father donated enough money that my attendance is expected. You're here because men like you need to be seen supporting causes like this. It's good PR for bad reputations." "You don't know anything about my reputation." She'd smiled then, small and knowing. "I know you're Dominic Ravel. I know what people say you do. I know that half the people in this room are afraid of you, and the other half are trying to figure out how to use you. And I know you're bored out of your mind." She'd been right about all of it. He'd asked her to dinner. She'd said yes, but only after making him wait 3 days for her answer. A power play he'd recognized and respected. Over the following months, he'd pursued her with the same focused intensity he brought to everything, and she'd let herself be caught, but on her own terms. She'd known who he was from the beginning, what he was. She'd walked into their marriage with her eyes open, never demanding that he pretend to be something he wasn't. He thought that meant she accepted him, darkness and all. But acceptance wasn't the same as approval, was it? And approval wasn't the same as being willing to tolerate disrespect. The whiskey was gone. He poured another, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when their marriage had shifted from partnership to performance. When had she started wearing her role as his wife like a costume she could remove at the end of the day? When had he started seeing her as an accessory to his life rather than a person in her own right? His phone buzzed again. Then again. The Empire demanding his attention, problems multiplying in his absence. Dominic ignored them all. Let the world burn for a few hours. Let Marcus handle the emergencies. Right now, in this empty house, surrounded by the evidence of Lena's methodical departure, Dominic needed to sit with what he'd done. What he destroyed through carelessness and arrogance and the assumption that some things were permanent enough to survive neglect. He picked up the divorce papers again, reading through the legal language with the attention he usually reserved for contracts worth millions. She'd been fair, almost generous in her division of assets. This wasn't revenge. This was simply done, over, finished. The finality of it was what hurt most, not the anger he could have fought against, not the tears he could have tried to soothe. This clean, quiet ending left him nothing to push back against. She'd removed herself from his life as efficiently as she'd removed her belongings from the house, and he was left holding nothing but papers and the key she no longer wanted. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the landscaping crew starting their work, the buzz of machinery a faint counterpoint to his thoughts. Life continuing, indifferent to personal catastrophes. Dominic pulled out his phone one more time, scrolling to Lena's contact. The photo that came up was from their wedding day, her in that dress that had cost more than most people's cars, him in his tuxedo, both of them smiling like they believed in forever. He'd kept that photo all these years. Had she deleted his from her phone before she left? Probably. She was thorough like that. He typed out a message. "We need to talk." Deleted it. Tried again. "Please, just tell me why." Deleted that too. Finally, "I'm sorry." His thumb hovered over the send button for a long moment before he deleted that message as well and put the phone down. What was the point? She'd made her position clear through action rather than words. And in their world, in his world, actions were the only truth that mattered. Dominic stood, leaving the divorce papers on the island, leaving the empty glass, leaving everything exactly as it was. He climbed the stairs one more time, returning to the bedroom that was now just his, and lay down on the bed without removing his clothes or shoes. The ceiling stared back at him, blank and white, and offering no answers. He'd faced down rivals with guns, negotiated deals worth fortunes, built an empire from nothing but will and violence and strategic ruthlessness. He'd survived things that should have killed him, won battles that should have been unwinnable. But lying here in this bed, on his side while hers remained empty, Dominic confronted a truth more devastating than any enemy he'd ever faced. He'd had everything that mattered, and he'd been too blind to see it until it was gone. The sun climbed higher. The house remained silent, and somewhere in the city, in a place he didn't know and couldn't reach, Lena was building a new life without him. A life where she would finally matter more than an afterthought, more than a beautiful object to be possessed and neglected. Dominic closed his eyes against the morning light, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he lay there in the emptiness she'd left behind, finally understanding what he'd lost, finally grasping that power couldn't command love, and silence had never meant forgiveness. Some endings arrived quietly, without drama or confrontation. They arrived in empty closets and signed papers and a key left behind. They arrived when you weren't paying attention, when you were too busy living your life to notice someone else was preparing to leave it. And once chosen, once set in motion with that kind of deliberate care, they couldn't be undone. The house that had been a fortress now felt like a tomb. And Dominic Ravel, who controlled so much, who commanded fear and respect and obedience, finally understood the limits of his power. He couldn't make her come back. He couldn't rewind time to the moment before he'd made his choices. He couldn't force her to forgive what he himself didn't deserve to have forgiven. All he could do was lie here in the wreckage of what they'd been and learn to live with the absence she'd chosen. Outside, the world continued. The empire waited. Calls would be returned, decisions made, power exercised. Dominic Ravel would rise from this bed and resume his throne, because that's what men like him did. They survived. They endured. But something had broken in the quiet hours of this morning, something that all the money and influence in the world couldn't repair. And in that breaking, In that clean and quiet ending, Lena had taught him a final lesson. The cruelest prisons are the ones we build ourselves. And sometimes freedom means leaving behind everything familiar, even if it means walking away with nothing but your dignity intact. 3 hours later, Dominic finally moved. Not because he'd reached any profound understanding or found peace with what had happened. He moved because Marcus had called 17 times, and even grief, if that's what this hollowness was, couldn't completely override years of discipline. The Empire didn't pause for personal catastrophes. It never had. He showered in the bathroom that still smelled faintly of Lena's jasmine soap, even though she'd taken the bottle with her. Ghost scents lingering in the steam. He dressed in fresh clothes from his side of the closet, each movement automatic, his mind still circling the same questions without answers. The divorce papers remained on the kitchen island where he'd left them. He picked them up, folded them carefully, and slipped them into his briefcase. Evidence. Proof that this morning had actually happened and wasn't just some fever dream born of exhaustion and guilt. When he finally called Marcus back, his second-in-command answered on the first ring. "Where the hell have you been?" Marcus demanded, his usual deference stripped away by concern. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. We've got a situation with the shipment. The Constantine brothers are making noise about last night's negotiation, and are you even listening to me?" "I'm listening," Dominic said, though he wasn't, not really. "Handle the Constantines. Tell them we'll meet next week to finalize terms. As for the shipment, reroute through the secondary channels like we discussed." Silence on the other end. Then more carefully. "You sound off. What's wrong?" "Nothing that concerns you." "Dominic." "I said handle it, Marcus. That's what I pay you for." He ended the call before Marcus could push further, already regretting the harshness. Marcus had been with him for almost a decade, had earned the right to ask questions. But Dominic wasn't ready to voice what had happened. Saying it out loud would make it real in a way that even the empty house hadn't. His phone buzzed with a text. Not Marcus this time, but a number he recognized immediately, despite having no name attached to it. The penthouse, the distraction, the woman who was probably just waking up now, wondering where he'd gone. "Last night was amazing. When can I see you again?" Dominic stared at the message, feeling nothing, less than nothing. The affair that had seemed like an escape 12 hours ago now looked like what it was. A symptom of a deeper rot, a shortcut to feeling something when his real life had gone numb. He deleted the message without responding. Then, after a moment's consideration, he blocked the number entirely. Too little, too late. The damage was done. But perhaps there was something to be said for not compounding mistakes. The house felt oppressive now, each empty room a reminder of what he'd lost. Dominic grabbed his keys and left, needing motion, needing to escape the suffocating silence even though he knew the absence would follow him wherever he went. The city was alive with mid-morning traffic, people rushing to jobs and meetings and lives that hadn't imploded overnight. Dominic drove without destination, letting instinct guide him through familiar streets. He ended up downtown, parking in the underground garage of the building that housed his legitimate business interests. The front that made his money clean, the acceptable face of an unacceptable empire. His private office occupied the top floor, all glass and steel and carefully curated art. His assistant, Claire, looked up in surprise when he stepped off the elevator. "Mr. Ravel, I wasn't expecting you today. You have no appointments until—" "Clear my schedule," he interrupted, moving past her desk toward his office. "I don't want to be disturbed." "Sir, you have the meeting with the investors at 2 and the conference call with the Tokyo office at—" "Cancel them. All of them." Claire's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing concern underneath. She'd worked for him long enough to know when something was seriously wrong. "Is everything all right?" "No," he said, surprising himself with the honesty. "But it will be handled. Just give me the day." He closed his office door before she could respond, shutting himself into the carefully controlled environment he'd built. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but Dominic turned away from them, unable to appreciate beauty when his own life had just been stripped bare. The office was safer than the house. Lena had rarely come here, so there were fewer ghosts, fewer absences to catalog. He poured himself a drink from the bar cart. His second whiskey of the day? Or was it third? And sank into the leather chair behind his desk. The divorce papers stared up at him from his briefcase. He pulled them out again, spreading them across the polished surface, studying them like they might reveal secrets if he looked hard enough. The date on Lena's signature was from yesterday. She'd signed them yesterday morning, probably while he was in his office handling the Constantine situation, completely unaware that his marriage was ending 30 miles away. Then she'd spent the rest of the day systematically removing herself from his life, timing her departure for when she knew he'd be occupied elsewhere. How long had she been planning this? Weeks? Months? The precision suggested serious preparation. You didn't just decide to leave and execute it this flawlessly overnight. This took time, strategy, the kind of careful thought he usually associated with business deals, not personal relationships. His phone rang. Not Marcus this time, but a number he didn't recognize. Dominic almost didn't answer, but years of paranoia made him cautious about ignoring unknown calls. Too many times, unknown numbers had meant opportunities or threats, and both required immediate attention. "Ravel?" he answered, his voice clipped. "Mr. Ravel, this is Catherine Chen from Chen and Associates." A woman's voice, professional and cool. "I'm calling on behalf of my client, Lena Ravel. I assume you've received the divorce petition by now?" The attorney. Of course, Lena would have an attorney, probably one she'd been consulting for weeks while Dominic had been oblivious. "I've received it," he said carefully, his business instincts kicking in even through the fog of shock. Never give away more than necessary. Never show weakness. "Excellent. As you've seen, my client is requesting an uncontested dissolution. The terms outlined in the petition are more than fair, and we're hoping this can be handled quickly and quietly without unnecessary conflict or publicity. I want to talk to her." A pause on the other end. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Ravel. My client has made it clear she has nothing further to discuss with you. All communication from this point forward should go through me." You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Catherine Chen's voice sharpened, losing some of its professional neutrality. "My client has made her decision. She's not interested in reconciliation, explanations, or prolonged negotiations. She simply wants to move forward with her life. I strongly suggest you respect that wish." Something in the attorney's tone triggered Dominic's well-honed sense for subtext. This wasn't just professional advocacy. There was personal investment here, a protective edge that suggested Lena had shared more than just legal details with this woman. "What did she tell you?" he asked quietly. Another pause, longer this time. "Enough, Mr. Ravel. She told me enough." The line went dead. Dominic set the phone down, his hand shaking again, that tremor he couldn't quite control, that physical manifestation of a crisis he didn't know how to fight. Because that was the problem, wasn't it? This wasn't an enemy he could outmaneuver or a deal he could win through force of will. This was simply over. And all the power he'd accumulated, all the influence he commanded, meant nothing in the face of Lena's quiet determination. He tried to imagine what she'd told the attorney. The affairs, obviously, affair, singular, though who was he kidding? The one currently ending wasn't the first time he'd strayed, just the first time he'd been stupid enough to let it become regular. What else? The long absences, the emotional distance, the way he'd treated their marriage like another asset to be managed rather than a relationship to be nurtured. Or had she told Catherine Chen about the darker things? The violence that sometimes followed him home, the nightmares that woke him at 3 a.m, the way he'd shut her out every time she tried to reach the person underneath the armor? Dominic stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. He paced the length of his office, whiskey in hand, trying to outrun thoughts that followed like shadows. The intercom on his desk buzzed. Claire's voice, apologetic. "Sir, I'm sorry to disturb you, but Marcus is here. He says it's urgent and he won't leave until he speaks with you." Of course he wouldn't. Marcus was nothing if not persistent. "Send him in." The door opened 30 seconds later, and Marcus strode in with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd earned the right to skip formalities. He was younger than Dominic by 5 years, built like a boxer, with the kind of street-smart intelligence that couldn't be taught in business schools. Dominic had plucked him from a rival organization 8 years ago, recognizing potential others had overlooked. Marcus took one look at Dominic, and his expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "What happened?" "Nothing that concerns the business. Don't give me that corporate bullshit. I've known you too long." Marcus closed the door behind him and moved to the bar cart, pouring himself a drink without asking permission. You look like someone died. Who do I need to hurt? Despite everything, Dominic felt a ghost of amusement. It's not that kind of problem. Then what kind is it? The words stuck in his throat for a moment before he finally forced them out. Lena left me. Marcus froze, glass halfway to his lips. What? This morning, I came home and she was gone. Everything of hers removed. Divorce papers on the kitchen counter. She's done, Marcus. Just done. Shit. Marcus drained his drink in one swallow, then poured another. Did something happen? Did she find out about... Yeah, Dominic cut him off. She found out. I don't know how long she's known, but she found out. They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken history between them heavy in the air. Marcus had been the one to warn him, months ago, that the affair was a mistake. That Lena wasn't the type of woman who would tolerate disrespect, no matter how comfortable her life was. Dominic had dismissed the concern, confident in his ability to compartmentalize, to keep his worlds separate. Arrogance, he saw now. Pure arrogance. Have you talked to her? Marcus asked finally. I can't. She's routed everything through her attorney. No contact, no discussion, just sign the papers and let her go. Dominic laughed, the sound bitter. You know what the worst part is? She was fair, generous even. This isn't about money or revenge. She just wants to be free of me. Marcus studied him with eyes that had seen too much violence, too many betrayals. What are you going to do? What can I do? She's made her choice. So that's it? You're just going to let her walk away? The question hit harder than it should have, exposing the helplessness Dominic had been trying to ignore. What would you suggest? Force her to come back? Manipulate her through threats or leverage? Use the very tactics that probably drove her away in the first place? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking what you want. What did he want? The question should have been simple, but Dominic found himself unable to answer. He'd spent so long pursuing power, building his empire, making himself untouchable, that he'd forgotten how to want things on a personal level. Or maybe he'd never learned in the first place. I want to understand why, he said finally. When she decided, what I did that was finally too much. I want... He trailed off, unable to articulate the ache in his chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with genuine loss. Marcus set his glass down with a soft click. You want her back. It's too late for that. Maybe, but that's not what I asked. Dominic turned to the windows, looking out at the city he'd conquered through ruthlessness and strategy. From up here, it looked manageable, comprehensible. Nothing like the chaos currently tearing through his personal life. Even if I wanted her back, he said quietly, I wouldn't know how to be what she needs. This morning proved that. I had everything, a beautiful wife, a stable home, something real in a life built on lies. And I still found a way to sabotage it. What makes you think I could do better a second time? I don't know if you could, Marcus said bluntly, but I know you're not even trying. You're just accepting defeat, which isn't like you at all. This isn't a business negotiation. No, it's more important than that, which is why I don't understand why you're rolling over. Dominic's phone buzzed before he could respond. Another unknown number, another call he almost ignored, but something made him answer. Mr. Ravel? A different voice this time, male, hesitant. This is David Walsh. I'm the superintendent of the building at 1247 Madison Avenue. I have some items here that belong to you, or belong to someone at your address. A woman dropped them off this morning with instructions to call you. 1247 Madison Avenue. They're his address. What kind of items? Personal effects, sir. Looks like clothing, some documents, photographs. She said they weren't hers to take, so she was returning them. Even in leaving, Lena was meticulous. Anything that belonged to him, anything that might create future entanglement, returned cleanly. No loose ends. I'll send someone to pick them up, Dominic said mechanically. Actually, sir, she specifically requested that you come in person. She left a note saying if you didn't show up yourself within 48 hours, I should donate everything to charity. Of course she did. One last maneuver, forcing him to face the reality of what was happening rather than delegating it away like everything else in his life. I'll be there this afternoon, he heard himself say. He ended the call and looked at Marcus. She's returning my things, personal effects she doesn't want. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's cold. That's thorough. Dominic felt something shift in his chest, some combination of admiration and devastation. She thought of everything, every angle, every contingency. She didn't just leave Marcus. She extracted herself like a surgeon removing a tumor, making sure nothing got left behind to cause complications. Sounds like someone I know, Marcus observed. Maybe that's why you married her in the first place. You recognized a kindred spirit. The observation stung because it was true. He had recognized something in Lena that first night, a steel core underneath the elegance, a strategic mind that could match his own. He'd been drawn to her strength, even as he'd spent the following years trying to ignore it, to reduce her to nothing more than the beautiful accessory on his arm. What a waste. What a profound, irredeemable waste. I need to go, Dominic said abruptly, gathering the divorce papers and shoving them back into his briefcase. Can you handle things here for the rest of the day? Where are you going? To pick up my things, and maybe... He trailed off, not wanting to voice the desperate hope forming in his mind. Maybe the superintendent knew something. Maybe Lena had said something, dropped some hint about where she'd gone or what she was thinking. Maybe there was still a thread he could pull. A way to unravel her careful departure and find a path back to her. Marcus seemed to read his thoughts. Don't, he said quietly. Don't go there hoping for answers she's already made clear she won't give you. That way lies obsession, and obsession makes men stupid. I'm already stupid. I destroyed my marriage for what? A temporary escape that meant nothing? Then don't compound the stupidity by stalking her through building superintendents and attorneys. If you want to fix this, if you even can fix this, you need to do it right. And that starts with respecting the boundaries she's set. Dominic knew Marcus was right. Knew it with the same certainty he knew how to read a balance sheet or anticipate a rival's next move. But knowledge and acceptance were different things entirely, and right now, acceptance felt impossible. Just handle the business, he said, moving toward the door. I'll be back tomorrow. Dominic, Marcus's voice stopped him at the threshold. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Lena was good for you. Better than you deserved, probably. And I'm sorry you lost that. The sympathy was almost harder to bear than the loss itself. Dominic nodded once, not trusting his voice, and left. The drive to Madison Avenue took longer than it should have, traffic thick with delivery trucks and taxis. Dominic used the time to construct scenarios in his mind, each more unlikely than the last. Lena would be there, waiting, ready to talk. Or she'd left a letter explaining everything, giving him closure. Or the superintendent would know where she'd gone, would accidentally let something slip that Dominic could use to find her. Fantasy, all of it. But fantasies were safer than the truth currently dismantling his life. The building was one of those pre-war structures that commanded premium prices for their historic charm and solid construction. Dominic had lived here for 2 years before buying the house, back when proximity to the office mattered more than space. The current superintendent was new since his time, a thin man in his 50s with careful eyes that probably saw more than residents wanted him to. Mr. Ravel? He asked when Dominic introduced himself. Come with me. I stored everything in the package room. They rode the elevator in silence, descended into the basement where the building kept deliveries and storage lockers. David Walsh led him to a corner where 3 boxes sat, neatly labeled in Lena's handwriting. She brought these herself? Dominic asked, unable to help the question. Yes, sir. Early this morning, around 7. She was very specific about the instructions. Did she say anything else? Walsh hesitated, clearly debating how much to share. She seemed resolved, if that makes sense. Not angry or upset, just very calm and certain about what she was doing. Resolved. Certain. The words hit like physical blows. Did she mention where she was going? No, sir, and I didn't ask. Seemed like she valued her privacy. Of course she did. And of course this stranger had respected that privacy in a way Dominic was currently struggling to. He loaded the boxes into his car, each one a physical reminder of the life he'd lost. Back at the house, it was getting harder to think of it as home. He carried them inside and set them in the living room, unsure what to do with them. Opening the boxes felt like a violation, but leaving them sealed felt like cowardice. Finally, he compromised, opening just the first one to see what Lena had deemed important enough to return. Photographs, mostly. Their wedding album, leather-bound and expensive. Pictures from vacations they'd taken in the early years, Paris, Santorini, that week in Kyoto where they'd barely left the hotel room. Candid shots of them at various events, Lena in designer gowns, Dominic in his armor of expensive suits. They looked happy in the photos. He'd forgotten they'd ever looked that happy. Underneath the photographs, he found the love letters he'd written her during their courtship. Dominic hadn't known he was capable of such sentiment until Lena had inspired it, drawing out a version of himself he'd thought long dead. He picked up one at random, his own handwriting achingly familiar on the expensive stationery. Lena, every moment with you feels like coming home to a place I didn't know existed. You see me, really see me, and somehow you stay anyway. I don't know what I did to deserve that, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life earning it. The irony was too cruel. He'd promised to earn her faith, her trust, her love. Instead, he'd taken it for granted until it evaporated. Dominic set the letter down carefully, unable to read more. The other boxes could wait. He couldn't handle any more evidence of what he'd destroyed. Not tonight. His phone buzzed. Marcus checking in. Everything okay? He typed back, fine. Just going through some things. The response came quickly. Don't torture yourself. What's done is done. But that was the problem, wasn't it? What was done couldn't be undone. The affair couldn't be unfucked. The neglect couldn't be retroactively transformed into attention. The marriage couldn't be rewound to the point where he still had a chance to choose differently. Time was a bastard that way. It only moved in one direction, carrying consequences forward, never allowing do-overs. Dominic poured himself another drink, definitely his fourth of the day, possibly his fifth, and sat among the boxes in his empty living room, surrounded by the detritus of a relationship he'd killed through inattention and selfishness. The house settled around him, making those small noises old houses make. But without Lena's presence to animate the space, without her music or her voice, or the small sounds of her moving through rooms, the noises felt hollow. The house wasn't alive anymore. It was just a structure, expensive and well-appointed, and utterly devoid of meaning. He thought about calling Catherine Chen back, about begging for 5 minutes of Lena's time, just 5 minutes to explain or apologize or whatever futile gesture might ease this ache. But Marcus's warning echoed in his mind. Obsession makes men stupid. So instead, Dominic sat in the gathering darkness, not bothering to turn on lights, letting the shadows claim the room the way absence was claiming his life. Tomorrow he'd have to return to being the Dominic Ravel everyone expected, the strategist, the power broker, the man who commanded respect through fear and careful calculation. Tomorrow the empire would require his attention, and he'd give it, because that's what he did. That's what he was good at. But tonight, in this empty house, surrounded by photographs of better days and promises he'd broken, Dominic allowed himself to sit with the full weight of what he'd lost. Not just Lena, though that loss alone was staggering. He'd lost the possibility of being better than he was. The chance to prove that love could transform even the darkest parts of him. The future they might have built if he'd been brave enough to choose her over his worst impulses. Gone. All of it, gone. And the worst part, the part that made the whiskey taste like ash and the photographs blur with unshed tears, was that he had no one to blame but himself. The darkness eventually gave way to dawn again, though Dominic couldn't have said when he'd actually slept. He woke on the couch, still in yesterday's clothes, the empty whiskey glass on the floor beside him, his head pounded with dehydration and something deeper, the physical manifestation of emotional exhaustion. The boxes remained where he'd left them, silent witnesses to his unraveling. He forced himself through the motions of normalcy. Shower, fresh suit, coffee he couldn't taste. The mirror showed a man who looked older than he had 2 days ago. New lines etched around his eyes, a brittleness in his expression that hadn't been there before. This was what loss looked like, he realized. This was the face of a man confronting consequences. Marcus had texted sometime in the night. Meeting with the Constantine rescheduled for tomorrow. Federal investigation hit a snag. Their informant went cold. We might have caught a break. Call me when you're ready to discuss. Business as usual. The empire rolling forward regardless of personal catastrophe, because empires didn't care about broken hearts or failed marriages. They cared about money and power and survival, and Dominic had built his to be ruthlessly efficient in all three. But for the first time in his adult life, the thought of returning to that world felt hollow. What was the point of an empire if there was no one to share it with? What good was power if it couldn't protect the things that actually mattered? He was halfway through his coffee when the doorbell rang. Dominic wasn't expecting anyone. Marcus had a key and would have let himself in. Deliveries came through the gate system, requiring advance clearance. For a brief, irrational moment, hope flared in his chest. Maybe Lena had come back. Maybe she'd reconsidered. Maybe... He opened the door to find a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in an elegant black pantsuit, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun. She carried a leather portfolio and wore the expression of someone who'd seen too many of these meetings to be moved by emotion. "Mr. Ravel," she said, extending a hand. "Catherine Chen. I thought it was time we met in person." The attorney, Lena's attorney, the woman who'd coolly informed him yesterday that his wife wanted nothing to do with him. Dominic didn't take the offered hand. "How did you get past my gate?" "Your wife, your soon-to-be ex-wife, gave me the code before she left. I'm returning it to you." She held out a slip of paper with the security numbers written in Lena's handwriting, along with some additional documents that require your signature. "I haven't agreed to anything yet, and you're within your rights to contest the petition," Catherine said evenly, "though I'd strongly advise against it. Contested divorces get messy, and messy means public. I don't imagine someone in your position wants his private life examined in open court." The implied threat was clear. Lena knew things about his business, about the sources of his wealth, about deals that wouldn't survive legal scrutiny. She'd been careful not to include any of that in the divorce papers, but if he forced a fight, those considerations might change. "Is that a threat?" he asked quietly. "It's a reality check. My client wants a clean break. She's offering you generous terms and asking for nothing beyond what's fair. Fighting her on this would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately futile. She's not coming back, Mr. Ravel. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone." Dominic stepped back, gesturing her inside with a bitter laugh. "Come in then. Let's get this over with." Catherine entered with the professional detachment of someone who'd witnessed countless domestic endings. She didn't comment on the boxes in the living room, or the empty whiskey glass, or the general air of desolation that had settled over the house. She simply opened her portfolio on the dining table and laid out more documents. "These are the final financial disclosures," she explained, her voice crisp and businesslike. "As you'll see, my client has been extremely fair in her accounting. She's claiming only what she brought into the marriage and half of the joint assets acquired during your time together. She's waiving alimony despite being legally entitled to it. She's even offering to let you keep several items that technically belong to her, including the art collection you purchased jointly." Dominic scanned the documents without really seeing them. Numbers and legal terminology blurred together, meaningless compared to the central fact. Lena was dividing their life with the precision of a surgeon, each cut clean and final. "Where is she?" he asked abruptly. Catherine looked up, her expression neutral. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information. I'm not asking for an address. I just need to know she's safe." "She's perfectly safe, Mr. Ravel, and she wants to keep it that way, which means maintaining her privacy from you." The words stung more than they should have. "You think I'd hurt her?" "I think she's protecting herself from a man who's already hurt her quite enough." Catherine's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine anger underneath. "Do you have any idea what she went through? The months of watching you lie to her face, knowing you were with someone else but too proud or too scared to confront you." "She told you that?" "She told me enough. She told me about the late nights you couldn't explain, the phone calls you took in other rooms, the way you stopped really seeing her. She told me how it felt to be invisible in her own marriage, to know her husband valued her so little that he couldn't even bother to hide his affair properly." Dominic felt his jaw tighten. If she knew, why didn't she say anything? Why go through the charade of everything being fine? Because she was preparing to leave, Mr. Ravel. Because she needed time to get her affairs in order, to secure her future, to make sure she could walk away cleanly. Did you expect her to confront you while she was still dependent on you? While she was still living in your house? Under your control? "I never controlled her." Catherine's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Maybe not consciously, but men like you don't have to issue explicit orders to exert control. Your whole life is built on intimidation and power dynamics. Your wife, and yes, I'm going to keep calling her that until the divorce is finalized. Understood that confronting you before she was ready to leave would have been dangerous. Maybe not physically, but emotionally, financially, strategically. So she waited. She planned. And she executed her exit with the same ruthless efficiency you probably use in your business dealings. The assessment was brutally accurate. Lena had played this exactly the way Dominic would have if their positions were reversed. Gathering intelligence, securing resources, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She'd learned from watching him, had absorbed his tactics and turned them against him. He should have been angry. Instead, he felt a wave of profound respect mixed with devastating loss. This was the woman he'd married, finally revealing the steel he'd always suspected was there, and he'd driven her to use that strength against him. "Did she ever love me?" he asked quietly, hating how vulnerable the question made him sound. Catherine's expression softened fractionally. "That's something you'd have to ask her yourself. But since she's made it clear she won't speak to you, I suppose you'll have to live with not knowing." She pushed a pen across the table toward him. "Sign the documents, Mr. Ravel. Let her go. It's the only decent thing you can do for her at this point." Dominic stared at the pen, at the papers that would legally end what he'd already destroyed emotionally. His hand moved almost without conscious thought, picking up the pen, positioning it over the signature line. "Wait," he said suddenly. "Can you give her a message?" "That depends on the message." "Tell her—" He paused, trying to find words adequate to the moment. "Tell her I understand. And I'm sorry. And if there's anything she needs, anything at all, she just has to ask." Catherine studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I'll pass that along. Though I suspect she doesn't need anything from you anymore, Mr. Ravel. That's rather the point of all this." He signed the documents in silence, each stroke of the pen feeling like a small death. When it was done, Catherine gathered the papers efficiently, sliding them back into her portfolio. "You'll receive copies once everything is filed with the court," she said, standing. "The process should take about 6 months, assuming no complications. After that, you'll both be free to move on with your lives." 6 months. Half a year for the legal system to catch up with what was already emotionally finished. Half a year of existing in this limbo between married and divorced, bound to someone who wanted nothing to do with him. "Miss Chen," he said as she moved toward the door. "Can I ask you something?" She paused, hand on the doorknob. "You can ask." "Do you think she'll be happy without me?" The attorney's smile was small and sad. "Mr. Ravel, she's already happier than she was with you. That's why she left." The words followed him long after Catherine Chen drove away, echoing in the empty house like an indictment. She's already happier, already better off, already thriving in whatever new life she'd built in the few days since leaving, while he was here, drowning in whiskey and regret, unable to function, unable to move forward or back. The day crawled past with excruciating slowness. Dominic tried to work, tried to focus on the Constantine deal or the federal investigation or any of the dozen other fires constantly burning in his world. But concentration eluded him, his thoughts circling back again and again to Lena, to the marriage he'd destroyed, to the future that had just been legally severed. Marcus called in the afternoon, his voice tight with concern. "We need to talk. In person. Can you come to the office?" "What's wrong?" "Just get here. Now." The urgency in Marcus's tone cut through Dominic's fog of self-pity. Whatever this was, it was serious enough to override everything else. He drove to the office building, navigating traffic on autopilot, his mind already shifting into crisis management mode. Marcus was waiting in the office, pacing like a caged animal. He wasn't alone. 2 other men Dominic recognized from the organization, Raphael and Chen, enforcers who handled problems that required muscle rather than negotiation, stood near the windows, their body language radiating tension. "What happened?" Dominic demanded, closing the door behind him. Marcus handed him a tablet. On the screen was a series of photographs, grainy but clear enough. Images of the penthouse downtown, of Dominic entering and leaving at various times over the past few months, of the woman who'd been his distraction, captured in intimate poses that left little to the imagination. "Where did these come from?" Dominic asked, ice forming in his stomach. "They were delivered to the office an hour ago. No return address, no explanation. Just the photos and a note." Marcus pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, unfolding it carefully. It says, "Everyone has secrets. Some are worth protecting. Others are worth exposing. Choose wisely." "Blackmail," Raphael said flatly. "Someone's trying to shake you down." Dominic's mind raced through possibilities. Rival organizations who wanted leverage. Business competitors looking for weakness. Federal investigators trying to create pressure. The list of people who might benefit from compromising him was long and varied. "Have they made demands yet?" he asked. "Not yet. This feels like a warning shot. They're letting you know they have the ammunition before they tell you what they want for their silence." Dominic studied the photographs again, seeing them through new eyes. These weren't casual surveillance shots. They were professional, well-composed, taken by someone who knew what they were doing. This wasn't some opportunistic paparazzi or jealous lover. This was planned, strategic, purposeful. "The affair is over," he said quietly. "I ended it yesterday. Whoever took these, they're working with old information." "Doesn't matter if it's over or not," Chen pointed out. "The photos still exist. Your wife might not care anymore, but these could still be used against you in a dozen different ways." Your wife. The words hit differently now, weighted with irony. Lena had already left. The affair that someone was trying to weaponize had already destroyed what it was meant to destroy. The blackmailer was threatening to expose something that had already cost him everything that mattered. "Wait," Dominic said slowly, a terrible suspicion forming in his mind. "What was the date on the envelope? When was it postmarked?" Marcus checked. 4 days ago. Why? 4 days ago. Right around the time Lena would have been finalizing her departure plans, signing the divorce papers, preparing to disappear from his life. "Show me the photographs again," Dominic demanded, taking the tablet and scrolling through the images with new attention to detail. The timestamps, the angles, the precise composition. This wasn't random surveillance. These photos were meant to document, to create a record, to build a case. "These aren't from a blackmailer," he said finally, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "These are from a private investigator." Marcus frowned. "I don't follow." Lena hired someone to document the affair. That's how she knew. That's how she had proof to show her attorney, to justify the divorce, to protect herself legally in case I tried to fight it. Dominic felt a hysterical laugh building in his chest. These photos weren't meant to blackmail me. They were meant to free her. "Then why were they sent here?" Raphael asked. "Because whoever took them finished their job and is cleaning up loose ends. They probably sent copies to Lena's attorney first, gave her what she needed for the divorce. These are just..." He trailed off, understanding crystallizing. "These are a courtesy, a professional courtesy from one person who traffics in secrets to another. They're saying, your wife knows, and now you know she knows, and here's proof of how thoroughly you were caught." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't a threat to be neutralized or an enemy to be fought. This was simply evidence of Lena's thoroughness, one more piece of her carefully constructed exit strategy. "So what do we do?" Marcus asked, finally. "Nothing. We do nothing. The threat is already realized. The damage is already done." Dominic set the tablet down, feeling exhausted beyond measure. Lena got what she needed from these photos. They can't hurt me any worse than I've already hurt myself. What about the investigator? Should we find out who... No. The word came out sharper than intended. Leave it alone. Lena paid someone to document my betrayal, and they did their job. There's no revenge to be had here, Marcus. Just consequences. Chen and Raphael exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the passive response. In their world, challenges were met with force. Threats were eliminated. Weakness was never shown. But Dominic was done fighting this particular battle. What was the point of destroying evidence when the evidence had already destroyed everything that mattered? "Get rid of them," he said, gesturing to the photographs. "Burn them, delete them, I don't care. They don't change anything. Lena's gone, the marriage is over, and these photos are just ghosts of mistakes already made." "Dominic," Marcus started. "I said get rid of them." He stood abruptly, unable to remain in the office any longer. "Handle the Constantine meeting tomorrow." "I'll be there, but I need you to take lead on the negotiations. Can you do that?" "Of course, but then we're done here." He left before anyone could argue, before the pity in their eyes could become unbearable. The elevator ride down felt interminable, each floor a small eternity, until finally he emerged into the parking garage and the relative privacy of his car. Dominic sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing through the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Lena had hired someone to follow him, to document his lies, to build a case against him that would be legally unassailable. While he'd been congratulating himself on his discretion, on his ability to compartmentalize, she'd been gathering evidence of his betrayal with the patience of someone planning a military campaign. How long had she known? The photographs were dated over several months, which meant the surveillance had been extensive. Weeks of having his movements tracked, his lies cataloged, his betrayal preserved in high-resolution images. And through all of it, she'd maintained her composure, never confronting him, never tipping her hand. The level of self-control that required was staggering. Dominic had seen men crack under far less pressure. But Lena had held herself together, had played her role as the dutiful wife while methodically constructing her escape route. She'd been stronger than he'd ever given her credit for, and the realization of just how badly he'd underestimated her was its own special kind of pain. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. "The photos were a gift, Mr. Ravel. Your wife requested they be sent to you after her departure as proof that her decision was justified. She wanted you to know she didn't leave on impulse or emotion. She left because she had irrefutable evidence of who you really are. Consider them a final lesson in the consequences of carelessness. J.W. Investigations." A final lesson. Even in leaving, Lena was teaching him something. Even in her absence, she was making sure he understood exactly why he'd lost her. Dominic read the message 3 times before deleting it. Then he started the car and drove, not toward home, but away from it, needing distance from the empty house and the boxes of memories and the suffocating weight of his own failures. He ended up at the marina where he kept his boat, a 40-foot sailing yacht he'd bought on impulse years ago and rarely used. The evening was settling in, painting the water in shades of amber and gold, other boats rocking gently in their slips. The yacht represented another excess, another expensive toy purchased to fill a void that material things couldn't actually fill. But tonight, it offered something the house didn't: solitude without ghosts. Dominic unlocked the cabin and descended into the teak-lined interior. It smelled of salt and canvas and old wood, clean and uncomplicated. No traces of Lena here. She'd always hated sailing, had only joined him once before declaring it wasn't her thing. This was his space, untainted by memories of what they'd been. He found a bottle of decent scotch in the galley and poured himself a measure, then carried it up to the deck. The sun was setting properly now, the sky on fire with reds and oranges and purples. Other people were out on the water, a few die-hard sailors taking advantage of the evening calm, a family returning from a day trip, their children's laughter carrying across the distance. Normal lives, uncomplicated lives. Lives where mistakes could be corrected and apologies accepted, and love was simple rather than strategic. Dominic had never had that kind of life. Even before the Empire, before the violence and the moral compromises, he'd been someone who lived in complications, someone who saw relationships as negotiations and trust as a calculated risk. Meeting Lena had been the first time he'd wondered if he might be capable of something different, something genuine, and he'd proven, definitively, that he wasn't. The scotch burned going down, but the pain was familiar, almost comforting. This he understood: physical discomfort, the slow dulling of sharp edges through alcohol, the temporary numbness that came with enough drinking. What he didn't understand was how to live with the absence Lena had left behind, how to exist in a world where she'd moved on while he remained trapped in the wreckage. His phone rang. Marcus again, persistent as always. "What?" "Just checking on you. You left pretty abruptly." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're falling apart, and it's starting to show. The men are talking, Dominic. They're worried about whether you can still lead." "Tell them I can." "Can you? Because right now you're acting like a man who's lost his edge, and in our world, that's dangerous. You know what happens to leaders who show weakness." Dominic did know. He'd taken advantage of such moments himself, had built part of his empire on the ruins of men who'd lost focus at critical times. The predators were always circling, always watching for the moment when strength faltered and opportunity presented itself. I'll handle it, he said, hearing the lie in his own voice. How? By drinking yourself to death on your boat? By obsessing over a woman who doesn't want you anymore? That's not handling it, Dominic. That's surrender. What would you have me do, Marcus? Fight for a marriage that's already legally dead? Force myself on a woman who left because I couldn't give her basic respect? Tell me, what's the strategic play here? Silence on the other end. Then more gently, I don't know. But I know this isn't it. Come back to the office. Focus on the business. Give yourself something to do besides destroy yourself. Tomorrow, Dominic promised. I'll be there tomorrow for the Constantine meeting. Tonight, I just need to be alone. Alone with a bottle isn't the same as actual solitude. It'll have to do. He ended the call before Marcus could push further, silencing the phone entirely. The sun had set completely now, the marina lights flickering on, creating pools of illumination against the gathering darkness. Other boats were lit up, people visible through windows and portholes, living their lives, apparently uncomplicated by the kind of destruction Dominic had wrought on himself. He thought about Lena somewhere out there in the city, or maybe she'd left the city entirely, started over somewhere new. Was she with friends, family? Had she found an apartment, and was she decorating it right now, choosing furniture that reflected her taste rather than his, creating a space that was entirely hers? The thought of her happy without him should have brought relief. At least someone had escaped this wreckage intact. But instead it brought a sharp, visceral jealousy. Not of anyone specific, but of the life she was building, the freedom she'd claimed, the future she'd secured by cutting him out entirely. She was already happier, Catherine Chen had said. Already thriving. Already better off. While he sat here on a boat he never used, drinking scotch he couldn't taste, trying to figure out how to exist in a world where the one person who'd ever made him want to be better had decided he wasn't worth the effort. The scotch bottle was half empty when Dominic finally moved from the deck, his legs unsteady beneath him. The marina had gone quiet, most boats dark now, their owners having returned to shore in lives that continued regardless of his personal apocalypse. He descended into the cabin, intending to sleep off the alcohol, but sleep felt impossible with his mind still churning through the same circular thoughts. Instead, he found himself opening the storage compartment where he kept navigation charts and emergency supplies. Buried underneath practical items was a small wooden box he'd forgotten about, something Lena had given him their first Christmas together. He'd stored it here when they'd stopped using the boat, when his life had become too complicated for leisurely sails. Inside the box were more photographs, but these were different from the ones the investigator had taken. These showed a younger version of himself and Lena, back when possibilities still existed between them. A candid shot someone had taken at a restaurant. Lena mid-laugh at something he'd said, him looking at her with an expression he barely recognized on his own face. Another from a weekend in the Hamptons, both of them windswept and grinning. A selfie she'd insisted on taking in Paris. The Eiffel Tower blurred in the background while they kissed in the foreground. Evidence of love that had been real once? Or had it? Had he ever truly loved her, or had he simply loved the idea of her, the way she made him feel capable of being someone better than he was? The distinction seemed important suddenly, though Dominic couldn't articulate why. His phone, still silenced but visible on the table, lit up with another message. Not Marcus this time, but a number he hadn't seen in years. Thomas Ravel, his brother. The preview showed enough. Heard through the grapevine about you and Lena. I'm sorry, Dom. Call if you need to talk. Dominic stared at the message, unsure how to feel about it. He and Thomas hadn't spoken in almost 3 years, not since their father's funeral when old resentments had surfaced and made it clear that blood didn't guarantee connection. Thomas had chosen a different path. Legitimate business, a normal life, a wife, and 2 kids in the suburbs. Everything Dominic had rejected in favor of power and control. He almost deleted the message. Almost. But something stopped him. Some vestige of the person he used to be before violence and moral compromise had reshaped him into someone barely recognizable. Before he could second-guess the impulse, Dominic called. Thomas answered on the 3rd ring, his voice cautious. Dom? Yeah, it's me. A pause, heavy with years of silence. I wasn't sure you'd call back. Neither was I. Dominic leaned against the cabin wall, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. How did you hear? Lena called me 2 days ago. She asked me to check on you after some time had passed. Make sure you weren't. Thomas trailed off, clearly uncomfortable finishing the thought. Wasn't what? Destroying myself? Dominic laughed bitterly. Too late for that. She seemed worried about you, which I found interesting given that she's the one who left. The observation landed with unexpected weight. Lena had called Thomas, had reached out to the brother Dominic had cut ties with, had asked him to provide support that she no longer could or would. Even in leaving, even in protecting herself, she'd tried to make sure he wouldn't be completely alone. The realization threatened to undo what little composure Dominic had maintained. Are you drunk? Thomas asked, reading something in the silence. Getting there. Where are you? The marina, on the boat. Jesus, Dom. You shouldn't be alone right now, and you definitely shouldn't be drunk on a boat. I'm fine. You're not fine. Lena made that very clear when she called. She said... Thomas hesitated. She said you'd never learned how to handle genuine loss, that everything you'd ever lost before was something you could fight to get back or replace with something else. But this is different. She told you that? She told me a lot of things, including why she left, what you did, how long she knew before she finally walked away. Thomas's voice hardened slightly. I want to be sympathetic, Dom, I really do. But she also told me enough that I understand why she had to go. Dominic absorbed the implicit judgment, the disappointment from a brother who'd already been disappointed in him for years. Did you call just to tell me I'm a failure? No, I called because despite everything, you're still my brother. And because Lena asked me to, and she's someone I respect, even if I can't say the same about some of your choices. The honesty was brutal, but somehow refreshing. Dominic had spent so long surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear, who feared him too much to offer genuine truth. Thomas's bluntness cut through the fog of self-pity and alcohol. I don't know what to do, Dominic admitted quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. I don't know how to fix this. You can't fix it. That's what you need to understand. This isn't a business deal you can renegotiate or an enemy you can outmaneuver. Lena made her choice, and you have to respect it. Everyone keeps saying that. Respect her choice, let her go, move on, but none of you tell me how. Thomas sighed, the sound carrying years of complicated history. Start by sobering up. Then come stay with me and Catherine for a few days. Get out of that empty house, away from the business. Give yourself space to actually feel what you're feeling instead of drowning it. The offer caught Dominic off guard. You want me to stay with you? Catherine suggested it, actually. She thinks you need family right now, even if that family hasn't been particularly close lately. And before you refuse out of pride or whatever, just consider that maybe accepting help is part of learning how to handle loss. Dominic wanted to refuse, wanted to insist he could manage alone, that he didn't need anyone's pity or charity. But the truth was, he was drowning here, and pride seemed like a poor life preserver. Let me think about it, he said finally. Don't think too long. Offer expires when you do something stupid, like try to sail drunk or contact Lena against her explicit wishes. How did you know I was thinking about... Because I know you, Dom. You're a strategist. You're probably already planning how to engineer an accidental meeting or find some excuse to reach out. Don't. It won't work, and it'll only make things worse. The accuracy of the assessment was unsettling. Dominic had been formulating exactly such plans, running scenarios where he might orchestrate contact without technically violating Lena's boundaries. Hearing Thomas identify the impulse made it sound as pathetic as it actually was. I should go, Dominic said, suddenly uncomfortable with the vulnerability this conversation was exposing. Call me tomorrow. Let me know if you're coming. And Dom? Thomas paused. I'm sorry about Lena, about the divorce, about all of it. I know it doesn't help, but I am. The line went dead before Dominic could respond, leaving him alone again with the photographs and the scotch, and the profound silence of a boat that had witnessed none of his failures. He slept eventually, passing out on the narrow berth with his clothes still on, Thomas's offer echoing in his mind alongside Lena's apparent concern and the growing understanding that he'd lost more than just his wife. He'd lost the person he might have become if he'd been brave enough to choose differently. Morning arrived with punishing brightness and a headache that felt deserved. Dominic forced himself upright, splashed water on his face from the tiny sink, and tried to assess the damage. His reflection in the small mirror showed a man who looked like he'd been in a fight. Bloodshot eyes, 2 days of stubble, skin sallow from too much alcohol and too little sleep. This was who he'd become in Lena's absence. This was the man underneath the expensive suits and controlled exterior. Stripped of her stabilizing presence, he was reverting to something raw and self-destructive. The realization should have been frightening. Instead, it felt almost liberating. At least this version was honest. At least this man wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. His phone showed multiple missed calls from Marcus, several texts from various business contacts, and one more message from Thomas. Offer still stands. Catherine's making up the guest room just in case. Dominic climbed back up to the deck, squinting against the morning sun reflecting off the water. The marina was coming alive around him, people preparing boats for day trips, maintenance workers making their rounds, the normal rhythm of a world that hadn't stopped just because his had imploded. He needed to make a decision. Return to the house and the empire and the life he'd built, pretend everything was fine until the pretending became reality again. Or accept Thomas's offer, admit he needed help, take the risk that vulnerability might lead somewhere other than destruction. The Empire won. It always did. Dominic locked up the boat and drove back to the house, stopping only to grab coffee strong enough to cut through the hangover. By the time he arrived, he'd reconstructed his armor piece by piece until the broken man from the marina was safely hidden underneath the mask of Dominic Ravel, crime boss and strategist. Marcus was already there, waiting in the driveway with an expression that suggested he'd been prepared to break down the door if necessary.
"You look like hell," Marcus said bluntly. "Good morning to you too. The Constantine meeting is in 3 hours. Please tell me you're going to be functional for it." "I'll be fine." Dominic unlocked the front door, stepping into the house that still felt wrong, still felt empty despite all his things being exactly where he'd left them. "Give me an hour to shower and change. We'll go over the negotiation strategy on the way." Marcus followed him inside, his sharp eyes cataloging details.
"Did you sleep here last night?"
"No, I was on the boat." "Drinking?" "Some." "Christ, Dominic, you can't fall apart right now. Too many people are depending on you. Too many threats are circling." The Constantine smell blood in the water. The federal investigation is gaining momentum, and half our suppliers are getting nervous about the instability. You need to pull yourself together. "I am together." Dominic headed for the stairs, needing the shower and the change of clothes, needing to complete the transformation back into someone capable of commanding respect. "I had one night of weakness. It's done." "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, this looks like the beginning of a spiral, not the end of one." Dominic paused on the stairs, looking back at his second-in-command, his closest thing to a friend in a world that didn't really allow for friendship. "What do you want me to say, Marcus? That losing Lena destroyed something in me? That I don't know how to function without the illusion that someone gave a damn about me beyond what I could provide?" "Fine. It's true. But it doesn't change the fact that the empire still needs running, deals still need closing, and threats still need neutralizing. So yes, I'm falling apart. But I'll do it on my own time, not when the Constantines are watching for weakness." Marcus held his gaze for a long moment. "You know what I think? I think you're using the business as an excuse to avoid dealing with what actually happened. As long as you're focused on deals and threats and strategy, you don't have to face the fact that you destroyed the one real thing in your life. And your point is? My point is that eventually you'll have to face it anyway. And when you do, if you haven't built any kind of support system beyond the organization, it's going to break you." "Noted. Now can I shower in peace, or are you planning to follow me upstairs and continue this intervention?" Marcus shook his head, but something in his expression suggested resigned acceptance rather than anger. 1 hour. Then we leave for the meeting. And Dominic, try to at least look like you're still in control, even if you're not. The shower helped. Hot water and steam, and the familiar ritual of preparation gave Dominic something to focus on beyond the emptiness echoing through the house. He dressed in one of his best suits, charcoal gray, custom-tailored, the kind of armor that announced power before a word was spoken. Added the watch Lena had given him for their anniversary, then took it off again when the weight of it felt unbearable. Chose a different one, anonymous and expensive, free of sentimental associations. By the time he descended the stairs, he looked like himself again, controlled, dangerous, unreadable. The man who'd spent the night drinking himself unconscious on a boat was buried deep,
locked away where the Constantines couldn't find him. Marcus was in the kitchen, going through notes on his tablet. He looked up when Dominic entered, and whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he simply nodded and said, "Better, you ready?" "Always." The meeting was held in neutral territory, a private room at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place that catered to people who valued discretion above all else. The Constantine brothers were already there when Dominic and Marcus arrived, along with their own advisors and enforcers, turning the meeting into a subtle show of force on both sides. Victor Constantine stood when Dominic entered, extending a hand with the careful courtesy of men who might have to kill each other someday. "Ravel, good of you to make time for us." "Victor, Anton." Dominic shook hands with both brothers, noting details with automatic precision. Victor looked confident, almost smug. Anton seemed more cautious, his eyes watchful. The dynamic between them suggested Victor was leading this negotiation, which meant Anton was the one Dominic needed to convince. They settled around the table, orders placed for food none of them would eat, drinks poured that would barely be touched. The preliminaries took 20 minutes, small talk about mutual acquaintances, careful probing about various business interests, the verbal dance that preceded actual negotiation. Finally, Victor leaned back in his chair and got to the point. "We've been reviewing the terms you proposed last week. They're not acceptable." "Which terms specifically?" Marcus asked, his tone professionally neutral. "All of them, the territory divisions, the profit splits, the timeline for integration. You're asking us to give up too much for too little guaranteed return." Dominic had expected this. The initial proposal had been deliberately favorable to his organization, a starting point designed to be negotiated down. "What would you consider acceptable?" Anton spoke for the first time, his voice quieter than his brother's but carrying more weight. "We want equal partnership, not subordinate status. 50-50 split on all joint ventures, equal say in strategic decisions, full transparency on financial operations." "That's not partnership," Dominic said calmly. "That's asking me to hand you half my empire in exchange for access to markets we could eventually penetrate on our own." "Could you, though?" Victor's smile was sharp. "From what we hear, you've been somewhat distracted lately, losing focus. We're offering you a lifeline, Ravel. Take it before you drown." The provocation was obvious, designed to test whether the rumors of his personal crisis had affected his professional judgment. Dominic felt Marcus tense beside him, ready to respond, but he laid a subtle hand on his second-in-command's arm. This required careful handling, not defensive aggression. "My personal life has no bearing on my business capabilities," Dominic said, his voice cold enough to frost the glasses on the table. "And if you're basing your negotiating strategy on gossip and speculation, you're making a fundamental mistake about who you're dealing with." "Are we?" Anton's eyes were steady, assessing. "Because the Dominic Ravel we've heard about doesn't make unforced errors, doesn't show vulnerability, doesn't give his enemies ammunition to use against him. But rumor has it your wife just left you. Divorce papers filed. Very public, very messy. That sounds like an unforced error to me." The room went silent. Even the servers seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, giving the table a wide berth. Dominic could feel multiple sets of eyes on him, waiting to see how he'd respond. This was the test, the moment when weakness would be exploited or strength reaffirmed. Everything hinged on his next words, his next move. "My marriage ending doesn't make me weak," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "It makes me focused. No distractions, no divided loyalties, no one to protect except the organization. If you think my divorce makes me vulnerable, you're confusing loss with liberation. I'm more dangerous now than I've ever been, because I have nothing left to lose." The lie felt true as he spoke it, and maybe that's all that mattered. Maybe if he said it convincingly enough, it would become real. Maybe he could transform grief into ruthlessness, heartbreak into strategic advantage. Victor and Anton exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. When Victor spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, losing some of its aggressive edge. "Fair enough. Let's talk about terms we can actually agree on." The negotiation continued for another 2 hours,
Thrust and parry, concession and counteroffer, the careful dance of men who understood that every word mattered and every weakness would be exploited.
Dominic felt himself slipping into the familiar rhythm, the part of his brain that handled strategy taking over from the part that was still drowning in loss. This he could do. This he was good at. Reading opponents, identifying leverage points, knowing exactly how much to give and when to hold firm. The Empire didn't require love or trust or emotional vulnerability. It just required competence and ruthlessness, and those he had in abundance. By the time they shook hands on a revised agreement, not quite equal partnership, but close enough that both sides could claim victory, Dominic felt almost normal again. Almost like the man he'd been before Lena left, before the photographs arrived, before everything he'd taken for granted had been stripped away. Marcus waited until they were in the car before speaking. That was well handled. For a minute there, I thought Victor was going to push harder on the personal angle. He tested it and decided it wasn't worth pursuing. Dominic loosened his tie, feeling the adrenaline of the negotiation beginning to fade. Smart of him. I wasn't bluffing about being more dangerous now. Weren't you? Marcus asked quietly. Because from where I sat, that sounded like a man trying to convince himself as much as the Constantines. Dominic didn't answer. What was there to say? That Marcus was right? That every word had been armor against admitting how badly he was actually handling this? That pretending to be unaffected was the only strategy he had left? They drove in silence back to the office, the city flowing past the windows in a blur of movement and noise, and life continuing regardless of personal catastrophe. Dominic's phone buzzed repeatedly with messages, business contacts, updates on various operations, the constant stream of demands that came with running an empire. And one message from Thomas. Last chance. Guest room is ready if you change your mind. Dominic stared at the message for a long moment, thumb hovering over the reply button. He could accept, could admit he needed help, could take the risk that family might offer something the Empire couldn't. Or he could delete it, return to his empty house, continue pretending that ruthlessness could replace everything he'd lost. Drop me at home instead of the office, he said abruptly. Marcus glanced over. You sure? We have the afternoon meeting with cancel it or handle it yourself. I need... Dominic trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. What did he need? Space? Time? Someone to tell him how to exist in this new reality where Lena was gone and nothing felt solid anymore? You need a break, Marcus finished for him. You need to stop running from what happened and actually deal with it. Since when did you become a therapist? Since I watched you nearly derail a crucial negotiation because you're barely holding it together. Marcus's voice was firm, but not unkind. Take the rest of the day. Hell, take the rest of the week. The business will survive without you for a few days, and maybe you'll survive better with some actual time to process this. The suggestion felt both terrifying and necessary. Time to process meant time to feel, and feeling meant confronting the full weight of what he'd destroyed. But maybe Marcus was right. Maybe pretending to be fine was only delaying the inevitable breakdown. When they pulled up to the house, Dominic sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Marcus, thank you for everything. For covering for me, for being honest, for not letting me completely self-destruct. That's what family does, Marcus said simply. Even the family we choose rather than the one we're born with. The words stayed with Dominic as he entered the empty house, as he stood in the foyer that still echoed with Lena's absence. Family. Thomas had offered him family, had extended an olive branch across years of silence because Lena had asked him to. Because even in leaving, even in protecting herself, she'd tried to make sure he wouldn't face this alone. He pulled out his phone and typed a response to his brother. I'll be there tomorrow, if the offer still stands. The reply came within seconds. It stands. See you tomorrow, Dom. Dominic set the phone down and looked around the house that no longer felt like home. The boxes of photographs still sat in the living room, unopened since that first devastating morning. The divorce papers were filed away in his study, waiting for the legal process to grind through its required steps. Evidence of an ending everywhere he looked, impossible to escape. But maybe that was the point. Maybe he wasn't supposed to escape it. Maybe the only way through was straight ahead. No diversions, no distractions, just the raw truth of consequences finally catching up with him. He'd spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of reckoning, building walls of power and control and violence to protect himself from genuine vulnerability. And it had worked, right up until the moment Lena had seen through it all and decided he wasn't worth the effort of trying to reach the person underneath the armor. That was the real loss, he realized. Not just losing her, but losing the possibility that he could be better. That love could transform even the darkest parts of him. That he was capable of being more than the sum of his worst choices. Lena had believed in that possibility once, had seen something in him worth nurturing, worth fighting for, worth staying beside despite knowing what he was and what he did. And he'd taken that belief and crushed it through carelessness and arrogance and the assumption that some things were permanent enough to survive neglect. No wonder she'd left with such finality. No wonder her attorney spoke about her with protective respect. No wonder even Thomas, who barely knew the details, understood that Lena's departure was justified. Dominic walked through the house one more time, turning on lights against the gathering evening. Each room was perfect, pristine, empty of meaning without someone to share it with. This was his kingdom, built on blood and strategy and moral compromise. And it was hollow, beautiful and expensive and completely hollow. Tomorrow he'd go to Thomas's, accept help, try to figure out how to exist in this new reality where power couldn't command love and silence had never meant forgiveness. Tonight, he'd stay here in the house that was no longer a home, surrounded by evidence of what he'd destroyed, and finally let himself feel the full weight of what that meant. The tears came unexpectedly, sudden and overwhelming, breaking through the careful control he'd maintained for days. Dominic sank onto the couch where he and Lena had once watched movies together, where she'd curled against him on lazy Sunday mornings, where they'd planned futures that would never arrive now. And he let himself break, let the grief consume him in a way he'd never allowed before, let the pretense of strength finally shatter. Because Marcus was right. The only way through was to actually feel it, to stop running, stop strategizing, stop trying to negotiate his way out of consequences that were absolute and irreversible. Lena was gone. The marriage was over, and all the power in the world couldn't change those fundamental truths. The crying stopped eventually, leaving Dominic hollow and exhausted on a couch that held too many memories. He fell asleep there without meaning to, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of days without real rest, and woke to find pale morning light filtering through windows he'd forgotten to close. His face felt tight from dried tears, his body stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. The house was silent around him, offering no comfort, just the persistent reminder that he was alone here and would remain alone regardless of how many rooms the structure contained. Dominic forced himself upright, moving through the mechanical rituals of showering and dressing. He packed a bag with clothes for a few days, feeling strange about the act of leaving his own house. When had he last stayed somewhere else voluntarily? Years, probably. The house had been his fortress, his sanctuary, the place where he could drop the mask of Dominic Ravel and just exist. Except he'd never actually dropped the mask, had he? Even with Lana, even in the supposed safety of their marriage, he'd maintained walls, protected himself from real intimacy, even while claiming to offer it. No wonder she'd left. No wonder silence had been easier than confrontation. What was there to say to someone who refused to be truly known? The drive to Thomas's house in Westchester took just over an hour, traffic mercifully light for a weekday morning. The neighborhood was exactly what Dominic had expected. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes with actual yards, the kind of suburban domesticity he'd always dismissed as boring and conventional. His brother had chosen this life deliberately, had walked away from the family business and everything it represented to build something clean and normal. Looking at it now through the lens of recent loss, Dominic wondered if Thomas had been the smarter one all along. Catherine answered the door before he could knock, her smile warm but her eyes assessing. She'd always been perceptive, Thomas's wife, able to read people with an accuracy that made Dominic slightly uncomfortable. They'd met only a handful of times over the years, but she'd never seemed intimidated by who he was or what he did. If anything, she'd seemed almost disappointed by his choices, like she'd expected better from her husband's brother. "Dominic," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I'm glad you came. Thomas is in the kitchen with the kids. Fair warning, it's chaos in there. Hope you're ready for it." The house smelled like coffee and something baking, wholesome scents that belonged to a life Dominic had never seriously considered. He followed Catherine through a hallway decorated with family photographs, Thomas and Catherine on their wedding day, Their two children at various ages, candid moments of genuine happiness that made something in Dominic's chest ache. This was what Lena had wanted, he realized. Not the specifics of suburban life, but the authenticity of it, the realness. A partnership built on actual intimacy rather than strategic alliance and carefully maintained distance. The kitchen was indeed chaos. Thomas stood at the stove flipping pancakes while simultaneously refereeing an argument between his daughter Emma, who looked about 7, and his son Michael, maybe 9 or 10. Neither child seemed particularly concerned with their father's attempts at mediation. Thomas looked up when Dominic entered, his expression shifting from harried parent to cautiously welcoming brother. "Dom, you made it. I said I would. You've said a lot of things over the years." Thomas flipped a pancake with practiced ease. "Didn't always mean you'd follow through, but I'm glad you did this time. Emma, Michael, say hello to your Uncle Dominic." Both children stopped arguing long enough to stare at him with the frank curiosity of kids who'd heard about this mysterious relative but never actually met him. Emma recovered first, offering a gap-toothed smile. "You're the uncle who does bad things, but Dad says we shouldn't talk about it?" "Emma," Catherine said warningly, though there was amusement in her voice. Dominic found himself almost smiling despite everything. "That's probably accurate, yes." "Cool," Emma decided. "Do you have any scars from fights?" "Lots. Can we see them?" "Maybe later. After pancakes." This seemed to satisfy her, and she returned to her argument with Michael about something involving a video game Dominic didn't recognize. Thomas caught his eye and shrugged in a gesture that said, "Welcome to my life." And something about the casual domesticity of it made Dominic's throat tight. This could have been his life too, if he'd chosen differently. Maybe not exactly this. He'd never be the kind of man who coached Little League or attended PTA meetings, but something real. Something that mattered beyond quarterly profits and strategic positioning. Something worth protecting, not because it represented power, but because it represented connection. Breakfast was surprisingly comfortable once Dominic stopped trying to fit himself into the scene and just let it happen around him. The kids lost interest in his criminal mystique quickly enough, more concerned with their own dramas and the quality of their father's pancakes. Catherine asked careful questions about his life that somehow avoided the topic of Lena while still acknowledging why he was there. Thomas maintained a running commentary about neighborhood gossip and the various challenges of parenting that should have been boring but somehow wasn't. Normal. This was what normal looked like, and Dominic had spent so long avoiding it, convinced that normal meant weak or ordinary or less than, that he'd never stopped to consider what it might offer beyond power and control. After breakfast, while Catherine took the kids to some activity involving soccer and snacks, Thomas led Dominic to the back deck with fresh coffee. The yard beyond was modest but well-maintained, a swing set in one corner, a vegetable garden Catherine apparently tended in the warmer months. "This is a nice life you've built," Dominic said quietly. Thomas studied him over the rim of his coffee cup. "It is. Not as exciting as yours, probably, but it's mine, and it's real, and I don't have to constantly look over my shoulder wondering who wants to destroy it." "You think that's what I do?" "Isn't it? You've built an empire on foundations that could crumble any second. One wrong move, one betrayed ally, one federal indictment, and everything falls apart. That's got to be exhausting, Dom. Always being on guard, always strategizing, never able to just exist." The assessment was accurate enough to sting. "Someone has to do what I do. The world isn't all soccer practices and vegetable gardens." "No, but your world doesn't have to be all violence and moral compromise either. You chose that. And you can choose differently if you want to. Can I, though? After everything I've done, everything I've become? You think I can just walk away from the empire and get a normal job, join the PTA, pretend the last 15 years didn't happen?" Thomas set his cup down carefully. "I think you're using the empire as an excuse to avoid dealing with the real question, which is why you sabotaged the one genuine relationship in your life. Lena told me some of what happened. Want to tell me your side?" Dominic didn't, but he also didn't want to deflect anymore. The walls he'd maintained so carefully were crumbling whether he liked it or not. "I had an affair. Not my first, probably wouldn't have been my last if she hadn't left when she did. I convinced myself she didn't know, that I was being careful enough. But she knew, hired a private investigator, documented everything, built a case against me, and then executed her departure with the kind of precision I'd use in a business deal. And you're angry about that? No, I'm devastated by it, because it proved that even when she was being betrayed, even when she had every reason to fall apart, Lena was stronger than I ever gave her credit for. She saw the situation clearly, protected herself, and left without giving me any opportunity to manipulate her into staying. Sounds like she learned from watching you operate. That's what makes it worse. I taught her how to be strategic, how to think 3 moves ahead, how to protect herself at all costs. And then I became the threat she needed to protect herself from. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Lena called me a week before she left. Did she tell you that? She mentioned you were in contact. She asked if I thought you were capable of change, of really fundamentally becoming a different person, not just modifying behavior, but transforming who you are at the core. You want to know what I told her? Dominic wasn't sure he did, but he nodded anyway. I told her I didn't know, that the brother I grew up with had potential for greatness and goodness, but somewhere along the way he chose power over connection and never looked back. I told her that people can change, but only if they actually want to badly enough to do the hard work. And I told her that in my experience, you've never wanted anything badly enough to risk the control you've built around yourself. That's a generous assessment. It's an honest one. And it's why Lena left, Dom. Not because you had an affair, though that was certainly the catalyst. She left because she finally understood that you'll always choose the empire over anything real. You'll always choose control over vulnerability. You'll always protect yourself, even if it means destroying what you claim to love. The words landed like physical blows, each one accurate and devastating. Dominic wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that Thomas didn't understand the pressures of his world or the necessities that came with the choices he'd made. But what was the point? His brother was right, about all of it. I don't know how to be different, Dominic admitted quietly. I've been this person for so long, I'm not sure there's anything else underneath the armor. Then maybe it's time to find out. Not for Lena. That ship has sailed and you need to accept it. But for yourself. Because this version of you, the one who trades genuine connection for strategic positioning, who builds walls instead of bridges, who thinks power can substitute for love, that version is going to die alone in a big empty house, surrounded by expensive things that mean nothing, wondering what the point of all of it was. Dominic looked out at the yard, at the swing set that spoke of children's laughter, at the garden that required patience and care rather than domination. What if I don't know how to be the other version? What if this is all I'm capable of? Then at least you'll know you tried. But Dom, I don't think that's true. I think you're perfectly capable of being better. You're just scared of what that would cost you in terms of the control you've spent decades building. They sat in silence for a while, the morning warming around them, sounds of the neighborhood going about its business filtering over the fence, a dog barking somewhere, a lawnmower starting up. The ordinary symphony of suburban life. Finally, Thomas spoke again. Stay as long as you need. Catherine and I talked about it, and we're good with you being here until you figure out your next move. Only rule is you leave the empire business at the door. This house is neutral territory. Whatever you do in the city stays in the city. I appreciate that. Both the hospitality and the boundary. And Dom? Maybe think about talking to someone. A therapist, a counselor, someone who isn't invested in maintaining your reputation or your empire. Someone who can help you figure out who you actually are when you strip away all the strategic bullshit. The suggestion would have seemed absurd a week ago. Dominic Ravel didn't need therapy. He was in perfect control of himself and his life. Except he wasn't, was he? He was falling apart in slow motion, losing pieces of himself he hadn't even known were there until Lena's departure had exposed all the empty spaces. I'll think about it, he said, and meant it. The days at Thomas's house developed a strange rhythm. Dominic would wake early, old habits dying hard, and sit on the deck with coffee while the neighborhood came alive around him. Catherine would emerge eventually with the kids, getting them ready for school or weekend activities, the controlled chaos of family life playing out with a normalcy that simultaneously soothed and disturbed him. Thomas worked from home most days, consulting for some tech company in a capacity Dominic didn't fully understand and didn't ask about. They'd have lunch together when Thomas took breaks, conversations that ranged from trivial to profound, slowly rebuilding a connection that had atrophied over years of deliberate distance. Emma decided Dominic was interesting despite his initial mystique wearing off, and she'd corner him with questions about whether he'd ever been in a car chase, yes. Whether he'd shot anyone, he declined to answer, and whether he thought her drawing of a dragon was scary enough. It was excellent. Michael was more reserved, but he'd sometimes join Dominic on the deck in the evenings, and they'd sit in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the neighbor's fence. It was during one of these quiet evenings, Michael having wandered off to play video games, that Catherine joined Dominic on the deck with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the chair beside him. "It's your house." She poured wine for both of them, settling into the chair with the ease of someone completely comfortable in her own space. "Thomas says you're doing better, less hollow around the eyes." "Is that his clinical assessment?" "That's his worried brother assessment. You scared him, you know. When Lena called and told him what was happening, how you were likely to take it. He thought you might do something drastic." Dominic took a sip of wine, considering. "I thought about it. Not anything permanent, but definitely self-destructive. Seems to be my default setting." "Why do you think that is?" "You sound like Thomas, suggesting therapy." "Thomas is right, but I'm asking as someone who's watched you for the past week try to figure out how to exist outside the structure you've built for yourself. You're like a man learning to walk again after years in a cast." The metaphor was uncomfortably accurate. That's what it feels like. Everything I've based my identity on, power, control, strategic thinking, none of it helps with this. I can't negotiate my way out of grief or strategize my way back into Lena's life. "Would you want to? Get back into her life, I mean?" The question caught him off guard. Would he? If Lena called tomorrow and said she'd made a mistake, that she wanted to try again, would he take her back? "I don't know," he said honestly. "Part of me wants to say yes immediately, wants to believe we could fix what broke. But the truth is, I don't know if I'm capable of being what she needed. And forcing her back into a relationship with someone who can't give her that would just be another form of the selfishness that drove her away in the first place." Catherine nodded slowly, as if he'd passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. "That's probably the most self-aware thing I've heard you say. Thomas mentioned you've always been smart about business, about reading people and situations, but you've been remarkably obtuse about yourself. Deliberate obtuseness, mostly. Easier to avoid uncomfortable truths if you never look at them directly. And now? Now I don't have a choice. Lena's absence has made it impossible to avoid what I am and what I've done. I can either face it or let it destroy me. And I'm tired of being destroyed by my own choices." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the wine warming Dominic from the inside in a way that had nothing to do with alcohol and everything to do with the unfamiliar comfort of genuine connection. "She called me, you know," Catherine said suddenly. "Lena, about 3 days ago. Wanted to know how you were doing, whether Thomas had managed to get through to you." Dominic's heart rate accelerated despite his attempts to remain calm. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you're here, that you're struggling, but that you're trying. That for the first time, maybe ever, you're letting people help you instead of pretending you don't need help." Catherine paused, choosing her words carefully. She seemed relieved, but she also made it very clear that her concern doesn't change anything. "She's not coming back, Dominic. She wanted me to make sure you understood that." The words hurt, but they also brought a strange clarity. Lena cared enough to check on him, but not enough to reconsider her decision. She'd removed herself from his life while still maintaining enough compassion to ensure he didn't completely self-destruct. It was exactly the kind of measured response he'd expect from her. Strategic, but not cruel. Definitive, but not vindictive. "I understand," he said quietly. "And honestly, I wouldn't want her to come back unless I could prove I'd actually changed. Which I can't, because I haven't yet. Maybe I never will, but at least I'm trying to figure out who I am without the armor, and that's something." Catherine reached over and squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture of support that felt more genuine than anything he'd experienced in years. "That's all anyone can do, Dominic. Try. The rest is just details." The next morning, Dominic made a call he'd been putting off. He found Catherine Chen's number and dialed before he could talk himself out of it. She answered on the third ring, her voice professionally cautious. "Mr. Ravel, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I'm not calling about the divorce. That's proceeding as it should,
And I'm not going to contest anything. I wanted to ask if you could pass a message to Lena. A long pause. That depends on the message. Tell her I understand why she left. Tell her I'm not asking for another chance or hoping she'll reconsider. I just want her to know that her departure was the kindest thing she could have done for both of us, even though it didn't feel that way at the time. And tell her that I'm trying to figure out how to be better, not for her, but because she deserves to know that her assessment was accurate and I'm not running from it anymore. Another pause, longer this time. I'll pass that along. Though I should tell you she's doing very well, Mr. Ravel. She has a new apartment, she's reconnecting with friends she'd lost touch with during your marriage, and she's looking into opportunities that were closed to her before. Whatever guilt you might be feeling about how this ended, you should know she's genuinely happy. The information should have devastated him. Instead, Dominic felt something like relief. I'm glad. She deserves to be happy, especially if, that happiness has nothing to do with me. That's remarkably mature of you. Don't give me too much credit. A week ago, I was drinking myself unconscious on a boat, trying to figure out how to engineer accidental meetings. But I'm working on accepting that some endings are absolute, and this is one of them. Well, Catherine said, and there was something almost like approval in her tone. That's progress, at least. I'll relay your message. And Mr. Ravel? For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice by letting her go. She needs this freedom more than you probably realize. I'm starting to understand that. Thank you, Miss Chen. He ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of Thomas's guest room, processing the conversation. Lena was happy, thriving even, building a life that had nothing to do with him, and that was exactly what she should be doing. The revelation brought both pain and peace. Pain because it confirmed that she was better off without him, that his presence in her life had been more burden than blessing. Peace because at least one of them had escaped the wreckage intact, had transformed loss into liberation rather than letting it destroy them. 2 weeks after arriving at Thomas's house, Dominic made another call, this time to a therapist whose name Catherine had given him, a woman who specialized in working with what she called high-functioning individuals with complex trauma histories. The description had made him laugh. High-functioning seemed generous given his recent spiral, but he'd taken the number anyway. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's office was in the city, a quiet space decorated with plants and comfortable furniture that felt deliberately non-threatening. She was younger than Dominic had expected, maybe early 40s, with a direct gaze that suggested she wasn't easily intimidated. Mr. Ravel, she said, gesturing to a chair. What brings you here today? Where did he even start? With the affair? The divorce? The empire built on blood and moral compromise? The realization that he'd spent decades building walls instead of connections, and had finally paid the price for that isolation? My wife left me, he said finally, and I'm trying to figure out how to be someone who wouldn't drive away the next person who makes the mistake of caring about me. Dr. Mitchell nodded, pulling out a notepad. That's a good starting point. Tell me about your marriage. The session lasted 90 minutes, and by the end of it, Dominic felt simultaneously exhausted and oddly lighter. Doctor. Mitchell had asked questions that forced him to examine patterns he'd never questioned, behaviors he'd normalized, beliefs about himself and relationships that had been toxic from the start. We have a lot of work to do, she'd said at the end, scheduling their next appointment. But the fact that you're here, that you're willing to look at this honestly, that's significant. Most people in your position never get this far. What position is that? Powerful men who've used that power to avoid real intimacy, who've built entire lives around control and then wonder why they feel so isolated. You're not unique in that regard, Mr. Ravel, but you might be unique in your willingness to actually change rather than just complaining about the consequences. Dominic left the session feeling like he'd run a marathon, but he also felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Not hope that Lena would come back. Not hope that he could undo the damage he'd done, but hope that maybe, possibly, he could become someone different, someone better, someone who could build connections based on genuine intimacy rather than strategic positioning. It would take time, probably years, possibly forever, but at least now he was trying. 3 months after Lena left, the divorce was finalized. Dominic received the notification from Catherine Chen via email, brief, professional, containing copies of the final decree and instructions for where to sign documents acknowledging receipt. He sat in Thomas's guest room, staring at the email, waiting for the wave of devastation to hit. But instead, he felt only a quiet acceptance. The marriage was over legally, just as it had been over emotionally since that morning he'd come home to find her gone. He signed the documents and returned them, then called Marcus. "It's done," he said when his second-in-command answered. "The divorce is final." "How are you doing with that?" "Better than I would have been 3 months ago. How's the business?" "Running smoothly. The Constantine deal is holding. The federal investigation hit enough roadblocks that they're backing off for now, and we've opened 2 new revenue streams in the past month. You'd be proud." "I am proud. You've handled everything brilliantly while I've been wherever I've been. You've been getting your head straight. That's important too." Marcus paused. "So when are you coming back? The Empire misses its emperor." The question hung in the air, weighted with implications. When was he coming back? Did he even want to come back? The Empire had managed fine without him, which suggested he was less essential than he'd always believed. And the work he was doing with Dr. Mitchell, the connections he was rebuilding with Thomas and Catherine, the person he was slowly becoming, all of that felt more important than quarterly profits and territorial negotiations. "I don't know," Dominic said honestly. "I'm not sure the Empire is where I belong anymore." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time for a change. Real change, not just adjusting tactics, but fundamentally rethinking what I want my life to be about." A silence on Marcus's end, then, "You're talking about walking away. I'm talking about stepping back, letting you take over day-to-day operations while I figure out what comes next for me. You've earned it, Marcus. You've been ready for years. I've just been too controlling to admit it. This is about Lena. This is about me finally understanding what Lena understood all along, that the Empire isn't a life, it's a distraction from life. And I've been using it to avoid dealing with anything real for so long that I don't even know who I am without it." More silence. Then Marcus laughed, short and sharp. "You know what? I think this is the sanest thing I've heard you say in years. When do you want to make the transition official?" "Give me another month to make sure this isn't just temporary clarity. If I still feel the same way, we'll work out the details. You interested in becoming the new emperor?" "Hell yes. I've been waiting for you to realize you needed to step aside since about 2019. They talked logistics for a while, the practical details of transferring power in an organization that didn't exactly have corporate succession plans. But underneath the business discussion, Dominic felt something shift. He was letting go. Really letting go. Not of just the marriage, but of the identity he'd wrapped around himself for decades. It was terrifying. It was also liberating. That evening, he joined Thomas and Catherine on the deck again, this ritual that had become comforting in its predictability. "You look different," Catherine observed. "Lighter, somehow." "The divorce was finalized today, and I told Marcus I'm stepping back from the business." Thomas raised his eyebrows. "That's a big decision." "It's the right decision. I can't keep doing what I've been doing and expect different results. If I want to actually change, I need to change everything, not just make minor adjustments around the edges." "What will you do instead?" Catherine asked. "I have no idea. That's probably the scariest part. For the first time in my adult life, I don't have a plan, don't have a strategy, don't know what comes next. But maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing is part of learning to live differently." Thomas lifted his beer in a salute. "To not knowing, then, and to second chances, even if they look nothing like we expected." They drank to that. 3 people sitting on a suburban deck as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing, being present in a moment rather than constantly strategizing for the next one. 6 months after Lena left, Dominic saw her for the first time since that morning. It wasn't planned. He was in the city meeting with his attorney about the final transfer of business assets to Marcus when he spotted her through a cafe window. She was sitting with 2 other women, laughing at something one of them had said, looking relaxed and happy in a way he remembered from their early days together. His first instinct was to go in, to approach her, to somehow engineer a conversation, but he stopped himself, hand on the door handle, recognizing the impulse for what it was, the old Dominic, still trying to control situations that weren't his to control. Instead,
He stood on the sidewalk and just watched for a moment, taking in the evidence of her new life. She wore her hair differently, shorter than when they'd been together. Her clothes were her own style, not the designer labels he'd preferred. She looked like herself in a way she never quite had during their marriage, like she'd finally found space to be fully who she was. And yes, she looked happy, genuinely, authentically happy. Dominic felt tears prick his eyes, but they weren't tears of grief this time. They were tears of gratitude. Gratitude that she'd been strong enough to leave when he couldn't give her what she needed. Gratitude that she'd found happiness on the other side of their ending. Gratitude that at least one of them had emerged from the wreckage intact and thriving. He turned away from the cafe without going in, continuing down the sidewalk toward his attorney's office. Let her have her coffee, and her friends, and her laughter. Let her have the life she'd built without him. Some endings arrived quietly, he'd learned. They arrived in empty closets and signed papers and the realization that you'd lost something irreplaceable through your own carelessness. They arrived when someone you loved decided they deserved better than what you were offering and had the courage to claim that better life for themselves. And yes, they couldn't be undone. Once chosen, once set in motion, they followed their course to completion regardless of regret or belated understanding. But endings also created space for new beginnings, for becoming someone different, for learning that power couldn't command love and silence had never meant forgiveness, for understanding that the hardest thing wasn't losing what you'd taken for granted, it was learning to live with the consequences of that loss and choosing to grow from it rather than being destroyed by it. Dominic walked through the city, past buildings that housed his former empire, through streets where he'd once commanded fear and respect. None of it felt like his anymore. He'd given it to Marcus, stepped away from that life, and was building something new in the space that had opened up. What that something was, he still wasn't entirely sure. He was taking classes at the local university, exploring interests he'd never had time for before. He was volunteering at a youth center in the city, working with kids who reminded him of himself at that age, angry and lost and convinced that power was the only thing worth having. He was in therapy twice a week, doing the hard work of understanding why he'd built the walls he'd built and how to live without them. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't powerful. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself when he'd been building his empire. But it was real. It was honest. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, it was enough. That evening, back at the apartment he'd rented after finally selling the empty house, Dominic made one final call to Catherine Chen. "Mr. Ravel," she answered, surprise evident in her voice. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I saw Lena today, in a cafe. I didn't approach her, didn't interrupt her life. I just wanted you to know that I saw her and she looked happy. And I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For protecting her, for helping her get free, for being in her corner when she needed someone who would prioritize her well-being over everyone else's comfort. You did good work, Ms. Chen. I know I made it difficult, but you did good work." He could hear the surprise in her silence before she spoke. "That's unexpectedly gracious of you, Mr. Ravel. I've had time to gain perspective, to understand that Lena leaving was the best thing that could have happened to both of us. It destroyed me initially, but destruction creates space for rebuilding. And I'm rebuilding into someone who might actually deserve genuine connection someday, even if that connection is never with her again. She'll be glad to hear you found peace with it. If it's any consolation, she speaks well of you now, not about the marriage, but about who you're becoming. She seems genuinely hopeful that you'll figure out how to be happy." The information settled warmly in Dominic's chest. Lena was hopeful for him. After everything, after all the damage he'd done, she could still find it in herself to hope he'd find happiness. That was grace he didn't deserve but would accept anyway. Tell her that her hope isn't misplaced. I'm getting there. Slowly, messily, but getting there. I will. Take care of yourself, Mr. Ravel. You too, Mrs. Chen, and thank you again for everything." He ended the call and stood at his apartment window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Lena was living her life, happy and free, and exactly where she should be. Somewhere else, Marcus was running the empire with the competence Dominic had always known he possessed. And here, in this modest apartment that held none of the trappings of his former life, Dominic was learning to simply exist without needing to control or dominate or strategize his way through every moment. It wasn't the ending he would have written for himself 6 months ago, but it was an ending nonetheless. And endings contained their own kind of grace. They allowed for transformation, for letting go of what no longer served you, for understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love was releasing what you'd held too tightly. Dominic had loved Lena in his limited, damaged way, but he'd loved control more, and that had been the fatal flaw. Now, in her absence, he was learning a different kind of love. Love without possession, care without control, connection without domination. Whether he'd ever get to practice that new understanding with another person remained to be seen, but at least now he had the tools to try. At least now he understood that power couldn't command love, that silence was never forgiveness, and that the cruelest prisons were the ones built from fear of vulnerability. The city lights blurred as exhaustion finally caught up with him. Dominic turned from the window, moving through his small apartment with the careful attention of someone learning to inhabit space differently. Tomorrow he had therapy, then his volunteer shift, then dinner with Thomas and Catherine and the kids. A life. A real life, built on authentic connection rather than strategic positioning. It was smaller than his empire had been, quieter, less obviously impressive, but it was his, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, that was enough.